Why did the Athenians, staring down an invincible Persian army, make a decision that, by every military logic, seemed utterly suicidal, to attack at once? Why didn't they wait for the Spartans, Greece's most formidable fighting force, who were already en route? Every history textbook tells us of their unyielding bravery and unwavering faith in democracy. But what if I told you that was just a gilded facade, a convenient myth? In truth, the saga of Marathon isn't merely a tale of battle. It's a nail-biting political thriller, brimming with conspiracy, betrayal, and a desperate race against the clock. I invite you to step beyond being mere spectators and become investigators alongside me to collectively crack the code of this pivotal event. We'll uncover how the true Battle of Marathon wasn't fought on the plains, but within the Athenian command tent, mere hours before the first clash of swords. And what hung in the balance wasn't just victory, but the very survival of democracy itself. Let's transport ourselves for a fleeting moment to that very place, the plains of Marathon, in the sweltering August of 490 BCE. Try to breathe that air. It wasn't the crisp, invigorating kiss of a sea breeze. No, it was the dense, heavy atmosphere of the Athenian camp, a suffocating blend of 10,000 frightened yet resolute men's sweat, the tang of sour, watered-down wine from countless canteens, the faint wisp of smoke from scattered fires, and the earthy, sharp scent of wild thyme, crushed beneath thousands of sandals. The air itself shimmered with the intense heat and the weight of unspoken tension. Listen closely. Those aren't the sounds of battle. They're its ominous prelude. The monotonous rasp of sharpening stones against blade edges, the quiet clink of bronze armor as warriors tested it again and again, and the low, guttural murmur of dozens of Attic dialects, punctuated by nervous laughter one moment, a sharp dispute the next. And over it all, from the direction of the sea, came the barely perceptible hum of another camp, the Persian one. A camp larger than all of Athens combined. To truly grasp what churned in the minds of those men, we must decipher two pivotal codes embedded in their culture. The first code, Isonomia. Today, this word is often translated as equality before the law, but to an Athenian of that era, it signified something far, far grander. It was the very essence of their revolution, a seismic shift that had occurred just one generation prior. Isonomia represented the radical, almost outlandish notion that the vote of a humble potter from the Callimachus district held precisely the same weight in the popular assembly as that of the wealthiest aristocrat. This was their superpower, their bedrock belief, their premier export, a commodity they hadn't yet managed to sell to anyone else. Isonomia was their everything. The second code was the flip side of the first, its shadowy doppelganger, an all-consuming, almost paranoid dread of tyranny. Only 20 years earlier, Athens had expelled its last tyrant, Hippias, an experience that carved a deep, indelible trauma into their collective consciousness. The word tyrant was the gravest insult imaginable. Even the mere suspicion of sympathizing with tyranny was a death sentence. They were ready to die for their freedom, yet even more terrifying was the thought that one of their own, an Athenian, might snatch it away, exploiting the chaos of war. This wasn't an abstract fear, it was terrifyingly real, for the exiled tyrant Hippias himself waited in the Persian camp, biding his time. Thus, every hoplite standing on the plains of Marathon, from the humblest farmer to the highest-ranking general, wasn't just defending soil. He was defending his right to speak, his right to cast a vote, his right to stand as an equal. To them, the Persian threat wasn't merely an invasion. It was an existential assault on their very way of life, an insidious attempt to hurl them back into the gloom of autocracy, where the will of one man outweighed the voices of tens of thousands. They were not simply an army. They were an armed popular assembly, prepared to die for their very protocols, their established ways of governance. If we were to find a modern parallel, Athenian democracy in 490 BCE wasn't an established institution. No, It was a fragile, audacious startup, freshly launched with a revolutionary product called Power of the People. And this startup, before it could even secure a second round of investment, found itself facing a hostile takeover bid from a colossal multinational corporation, the Persian Empire, which controlled 90% of their known market. And the most terrifying part, and this is the crux of our entire narrative, was that a segment of this startup's own top brass, old-school aristocrats were secretly negotiating to sell off the company. They detested the new course toward shareholder equality, a path that had stripped them of all their privileges. For them, a return to the old authoritarian business model under Persian external management was a far superior option to outright bankruptcy in a war they believed was unwinnable. It was within this simmering cauldron of fear, ideology, and personal ambition that the decision we now call the Battle of Marathon was forged. The true starting gun, the event that triggered an irreversible chain of developments, wasn't the Persian landing. That was anticipated. The genuine crisis unfolded later, when the Athenian army, having marched onto the Marathon plain, simply stalled. Day bled into day. 10,000 Athenians and their 1,000 loyal Plataean allies gazed across at the Persian camp, which was twice, perhaps even thrice, their size. The Persians gazed back, and nothing happened. This silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. A catastrophe was brewing in the Athenian camp, a paralysis of will. An army without orders begins to doubt, to fear, and to rot from within. And the source of this paralysis lay at the very heart of the command, within the council of the 10 strategoi. It was in this moment of utter uncertainty that our engine of history strides onto the stage. His name, Miltiades. And he was the most ambiguous and perilous figure in the entire Athenian camp. He wasn't a hereditary Athenian democrat, quite the opposite. Miltiades had long reigned as a tyrant of a Greek colony in the Chersonese, governing as a vassal of the Persian king. He had participated in Persian campaigns, dined with Persian satraps, and understood their language, their tactics, their mindset, and most crucially, their weaknesses. He had seen this invincible army from the inside. To all the other strategoi, the Persians were an almost mythical, incomprehensible force. To Miltiades, they were a knowable and, more importantly, a predictable enemy. His experience, which many in Athens considered a shameful blot on his reputation, suddenly became the most vital strategic asset in all of Greece. It was Miltiades, a man who had experienced tyranny from both sides, who entered the tent of the supreme commander, the polemarch Callimachus, and hurled onto the table an idea that, at that moment, sounded like pure madness. He declared, "We attack, now, immediately, without waiting for the Spartans. We march and strike the Persians head-on." To any military theorist of that era, this was heresy. To assault a numerically superior enemy on an open plain, where they could unleash their primary striking force, their cavalry. To willingly surrender the advantage of defense. To deny oneself the chance to await reinforcements from the finest warriors of Hellas. This wasn't merely a tactical plan. It was a defiant challenge to every established law of war. The reaction of the other strategoi was entirely predictable. His proposal had the effect of a bombshell exploding in the command tent. 5 of the 10 generals vehemently opposed it. Their arguments were utterly logical and sound. "Miltiades, you've lost your mind. We'll be crushed. Their cavalry will outflank us and butcher us. For every one of our hoplites, Darius has 2 infantrymen. The Spartans are already en route. We just need to hold out for a few more days. Your plan isn't bravery. It's a reckless gamble that will doom Athens. They weren't cowards. They were cautious, calculating commanders who looked at the disposition of forces and saw the undeniable truth. The odds of victory in open battle were virtually non-existent. But Miltiades saw more than just the battlefield. He saw the entire chessboard, and it wasn't the Persian numerical superiority that truly alarmed him. What truly chilled him was the silence in the Athenian camp and the agonizing wait. He understood that a faction of the strategoi, cloaked in prudent caution, was in fact deliberately stalling for time. They weren't merely waiting for the Spartans, they were waiting for something else. They were waiting for the Persian fleet, carrying a portion of their landing force and the very cavalry everyone feared, to round Cape Sunion and appear directly before the undefended gates of Athens. They were waiting for a signal from their accomplices within the city, from that fifth column of aristocrats who would throw open those gates. Miltiades recognized a terrifying truth. The primary enemy wasn't in the Persian camp. The primary enemy was sitting with him at the same table in the war council. Every hour of delay wasn't just an hour of waiting for the Spartans. It was an hour that brought the city's downfall through treachery closer. His seemingly insane plan to attack immediately was, in reality, a brilliant maneuver in a multi-dimensional game of chess. He had to strike the Persians on the plain to prevent them from striking the defenseless city from the sea. Thus, Miltiades' proposal fractured the Athenian command not simply into the bold and the cautious. It exposed the festering wound at the heart of Athenian democracy. The dispute over military tactics instantly transformed into an unspoken referendum on loyalty. And now, the fate of Athens hung on the vote of one single man, the wavering polemarch Callimachus, who had to choose between sensible caution, which almost certainly led to betrayal, and a desperate gamble that offered the sole, fleeting chance of salvation. So, how exactly did Miltiades intend to win this battle? How can one emerge victorious when outnumbered, without cavalry, and on an open field? The answer is simple. You cannot play by the enemy's rules. You must force them to play by yours. Miltiades' plan wasn't a frontal assault. It was a perfectly engineered trap, with the very center of the Athenian army serving as the bait. It was a mechanism designed not for raw strength, but for exploiting the enemy's psychology and demanding flawless execution. Miltiades was poised to transform the Persians' greatest strength, their numerical superiority, into their ultimate weakness. Let's peek under the hood of this ingenious tactical decision. The classical Greek phalanx of that era was a monolithic rectangle, a wall of shields and spears, typically 8, sometimes even 10 warriors deep. Its strength lay in its integrity. Miltiades did the unthinkable. He shattered this convention. He deliberately weakened his center, stretching his front line to prevent the Persians from outflanking him. In the middle, he left only 3 or 4 ranks of warriors, essentially exposing the heart of his army. All the freed-up reserves, all the finest fighters, he shunted to the flanks, transforming them into 2 immensely powerful striking fists. This was a risk of colossal magnitude. If the weakened center had faltered and broken prematurely, the entire army would have been cut in half and annihilated within 30 minutes. Now, let's visualize the process step by step. Step 1. Deployment. The Athenians and Plataeans arrayed themselves in this strange, unprecedented formation with a sagging center. Opposite them, the Persians, with their best elite infantry in the middle and less reliable warriors from conquered nations on their flanks. Step 2. The attack. At Miltiades' signal, the Athenian phalanx didn't just advance, it charged the enemy at a run. This legendary marathon run, covering more than 1 mile in full armor, wasn't just an act of insane bravery. It was cold calculation. The Persians' primary tactic was to exhaust the approaching enemy with a hail of arrows. By running, the Athenians minimized their time under fire. For the Persians, accustomed to the slow, ceremonial approach of armies, this furious sprint was a shock. They believed they were being charged by a mob of frenzied suicidals. Step 3. The bait takes. The armies collide with a deafening crash of bronze. Just as Miltiades had planned, his weakened center buckles under the relentless pressure of the elite Persian units. The Athenians in the middle begin a slow, organized retreat. To the Persian commanders, the picture is clear. The Greeks are broken, victory is within reach. They hurl more and more fresh forces into the breach, surging deep into the Athenian ranks, savoring the taste of triumph. What they fail to notice is that they are walking straight into a snare. Step 4. The trap snaps shut. While the Persian center, blinded by its initial success, surged forward, the formidable Athenian flanks, commanded by Polemarch Callimachus and Strategos Themistocles, did precisely the opposite. They effortlessly crushed the weaker infantry on the Persian army's wings. And this is where the pivotal, brilliant maneuver unfolded. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, the Athenian flanks halted, pivoted inward a full 90 degrees, and with their entire mass slammed into the exposed sides of the Persian center, which had so unwisely overextended itself. The steel jaws clamped shut. The finest warriors of the Persian army, who moments earlier had considered themselves victorious, suddenly found themselves under attack from 3 directions. From the front, they were held in check by the retreating but unbroken Athenian center, while from both flanks, thousands of fresh, furious hoplites crashed into them. The perfect order of the Persian forces instantly dissolved into bloody chaos. This was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. Organized resistance became impossible. Panic set in, and a frantic retreat to the ships began. But wait, where was the most fearsome Persian force, their invincible cavalry, all this time? Why didn't it strike the flanks of the fleeing Athenians right at the outset? The answer to this question is the key to the entire story. Apparently, at the moment of the attack, the cavalry simply wasn't on the battlefield. The Persian commanders, confident that the Athenians wouldn't dare to attack, had already begun loading their horses onto ships to send them on a raid against defenseless Athens. Miltiades struck precisely during this brief window of vulnerability, this fleeting opportunity when the enemy was weakened. His audacious attack wasn't merely a tactical maneuver, but a preemptive strike based on impeccable timing and a profound understanding of the enemy's intentions. He wasn't striking at an army, but at its redeployment schedule. The miracle at Marathon wasn't a miracle, it was a triumph of intelligence, analysis, and incredible bravery. Let's momentarily set aside strategy and view this battle through the eyes of an ordinary person. Picture him standing in formation, an Athenian hoplite. He isn't a professional soldier, he's a farmer or a potter. He purchased his weapon and heavy bronze armor, weighing close to 65 pounds, with his own money. But the most crucial thing to understand about him is this. Just a few weeks prior, he, personally, stood on Pnyx Hill in Athens and cast his vote to resist the Persians. The decision to fight wasn't a king's command relayed through a dozen officers. It was his own deeply felt, hard-won decision. And now, clutching his spear, he has come here to personally fulfill what he himself voted for. He isn't defending an abstract homeland, he is defending his right to vote. This is precisely why we cannot discuss Marathon without naming 2 unsung heroes, without whom Miltiades' genius would have remained mere words. The first is Polemarch Callimachus. He was neither a brilliant tactician nor a fiery orator. He was the highest-ranking official, a sort of chairman of the board for this military campaign. When the strategists' votes were divided 5-5, his vote was the decisive one. Imagine the weight of responsibility on this man. On one side, the logical, reasonable arguments of those advocating for defense. On the other, Miltiades' audacious, risky, but brilliant gamble. Callimachus chose risk, staking not only his own life, but the fate of the entire city. He didn't invent the plan, but he brought it to life. In this story, he embodies not genius, but the courage of responsibility, without which any democratic system devolves into merely a debating club. The second, and perhaps most poignant hero of this battle, is an entire people, the Plataeans. Residents of the small Boeotian town of Plataea, they were loyal allies of Athens. When the Athenians sent messengers across Greece pleading for help, only the Plataeans answered the call. The Spartans cited a religious festival, while others preferred to wait and see. But the Plataeans sent every able-bodied man from their town, 1,000 hoplites. 1,000 warriors. It might seem like a drop in the ocean compared to the Persian horde. Yet, for the Athenian army, it represented a 10% reinforcement. These 1,000 Plataeans stood on the left flank and fought with such ferocity as if defending their own homes. Their loyalty wasn't merely moral support. It became a real tactical factor, strengthening one of the key hammers in Miltiades' trap. Without them, the Athenian flanks would have been weaker and the entire strategy could have crumbled. And now, for a striking, everyday detail that grounds this entire story and makes it utterly tangible. The primary tool of Athenian democracy, its nuclear button against potential tyrants, was ostracism, a vote for exile. And how did it work? There were no ballots made of expensive papyrus. Any citizen would pick up what was literally lying underfoot, a shard of a broken clay pot, an ostracon, and scratch onto it the name of the person they considered a threat to the police. The greatest political decision was made on common refuse. This was democracy in its most material, most down-to-earth form. And the irony of history is that these very same clay shards, discovered almost 2,500 years later in a camp pit near the Marathon tumulus, would become the crucial evidence allowing us to uncover the conspiracy behind this great battle. It seems like triumph is at hand. The Persians are routed, fleeing in panic to their ships, abandoning weapons, tents, and treasures. The Athenians, stunned by their own victory, wounded but exultant, stand amidst a field strewn with enemy bodies. They accomplished the impossible. They won. But it is precisely in this moment of euphoria that Miltiades' system confronts a perfect storm. As the last Persian ships pull away from the shore, the Athenian warriors notice two things. First, the fleet isn't heading east, back to Asia. It's turning south, rounding Cape Sunion, straight for Athens. And the second, even more terrifying detail, on top of Mount Pentelicus, towering over the plain, something glitters brightly. It's a bronze shield, polished to a shine, catching the sun's rays. It's a signal that traitors within the city are sending to the Persian fleet. The city is empty. The army is gone. The gates are defenseless. Come. And here, all the brilliance of Miltiades' plan turns against him. The very total concentration of forces that brought him victory on the battlefield became his primary vulnerability. To win the Battle of Marathon, he had brought every able-bodied man here. He put all his eggs in one basket and won. But this meant Athens itself was left completely defenseless. There was no garrison in the city, no army, only the elderly, women and children. The victory at Marathon had transformed into a deadly trap. Triumph on the plain could turn into the complete annihilation of Athenian democracy at its very walls. The conspirators' plan was simple and devilishly effective. If you can't defeat the army, simply bypass it. Miltiades instantly grasps the full horror of the situation. He has just won the most important battle in his city's history, but he is about to lose the war. The Persians are on ships. They are fresh. They have oars and sails. The Athenian army is on foot. They have just run 1.5 miles in full armor, then battled for several hours in a bloody slaughter. They are utterly exhausted. Between them and Athens lie 26 miles of sun-baked road. The race has begun. A race between the oarsmen of the Persian fleet and the weary legs of the Athenian hoplites. This was the precise moment when everything could have unraveled. The traitors' plan had nearly worked. They lost the tactical battle in the command tent. They lost the engagement on the field, but they could still win the ultimate prize, the city. All of Miltiades' strategy, all the warriors' bravery, all the sacrifices, all of it could have been for naught, thanks to one gleaming shield on a mountain and the speed of enemy ships. The entire history of Athenian democracy boiled down to a simple, brutal question of endurance. What is the worth of winning a battle if it means losing the war? Would the saviors of Athens make it home in time, or would they become the gravediggers of the very democracy they had just defended with their blood? Let's hit pause and be intellectually honest. The conspiracy theory isn't the only explanation for the events. The classic romantic version, which we all learned in school, posits that Miltiades simply swayed everyone with his bravery. There's also another, more modern and purely military theory that dominated the 20th century. It suggests that the Athenians attacked because their intelligence reported that the Persian cavalry, the most formidable threat on the plain, had for some reason been loaded onto ships. Miltiades' attack was simply an exploitation of a suddenly available tactical window. This theory is logical, but it doesn't explain the crucial points. Why was the treacherous shield signal given after the battle? And why did the Persian fleet sail toward Athens? Our version, based on the idea of a conspiracy, doesn't negate the cavalry theory. It incorporates it and gives it motive. Miltiades attacked because the cavalry wasn't there, yes. But he did so with such desperate haste because he knew that this cavalry was already sailing toward a defenseless city where traitors awaited them. Military opportunity and political necessity converged at one point. But beneath all this tactics and politics lay a simple and brutal economic calculation. This wasn't a war for glory or abstract ideals. It was a war against total bankruptcy and enslavement. The primary economic engine of Athens, their oil well, was the Laurian silver mines. It was Laurian silver that allowed them to mint the famous Athenian owls, the most stable currency in the Mediterranean, and more importantly, it was with this money that Athens would, a few years later, build the fleet that would save all of Greece. Losing control of Attica meant losing these mines. For the Athenian state, it would have been the end. And for the common hoplite, the farmer, even more was at stake. His land, his home, his family. In case of defeat, he faced either death or slavery, and his land would pass to Persian administration or returning aristocrats. Every warrior at Marathon fought for his personal economic sovereignty. This is why the actions of the Athenians after the battle were filled with hidden symbolism. That desperate forced march of the army from Marathon to Athens wasn't just troop movement. It was the final act of a political drama. Citizen soldiers, having just saved democracy on the battlefield, now had to save it at the walls of their hometown from an internal enemy. This was the most vivid embodiment of the idea of direct democracy. The very same people who make the decision to go to war bear absolute physical responsibility for it until the very end. They ran to prove to both traitors and Persians that the city and the army were one and the same. But the most powerful symbolic act unfolded after the victory. In keeping with ancient tradition, Athenians always laid their fallen warriors to rest in their homeland, specifically in the Callimachus necropolis, with the highest honors. Yet, the 192 citizens who perished at Marathon were interred right there on the battlefield itself, within a massive burial mound that we know today as the Soros. This was unprecedented. With this decision, the Athenians transformed the battlefield into an eternal temple of democracy. They didn't merely honor the memory of heroes, they forged a sacred site that, for centuries, served every Athenian as a powerful symbol. That freedom isn't forged within city walls, but in the unwavering readiness to die for it on an open field. This tumulus became the ultimate argument in any political dispute, a silent rebuke to anyone who dared question the values for which such an immense price had been paid. And now, having witnessed the political paralysis gripping the Athenian camp, the wild military logic of Miltiades' daring plan, the desperate race against time after the battle, and the dark shadow of treachery looming over the city, the picture snaps into frighteningly clear focus. All these disparate facts, the army's strange inaction, the weakened center of the phalanx, the inexplicable absence of Persian cavalry, and the treacherous shield signal, coalesce into a single, seamless mosaic. We now understand that in those August days of 490 BCE, there wasn't just one war raging, but two. One, an open conflict against the Persian invasion. The other, a clandestine civil war against a conspiracy festering within Athens itself. So, what's the true enigma of Marathon? It lies in Miltiades' decision to launch an attack, delivering a single surgical strike against two malignancies threatening to obliterate the Athenian polis. He grasped a truth others missed. Delay was not mortally dangerous because of the Persians. The Persians could afford to wait. Delay benefited only the traitors. Each passing day of inaction amplified fear and doubt within the camp and granted the conspirators precious time to orchestrate the city's surrender. The Battle of Marathon wasn't merely a clash of armies. It was, in essence, a battlefield coup d'etat, executed against the very faction plotting its own takeover within the city walls. Miltiades didn't just lead his army into battle. He issued an ultimatum to his fellow strategoi, generals, knowing some were traitors. He was, in effect, telling them, either you fight with me now and become heroes, or you refuse and forever be branded cowards and traitors in the annals of history. He stripped them of their ultimate weapon, time. The assault on the Persians was simultaneously an assault on their scheme. By crushing the Persian infantry on land, he rendered any cavalry landing near Athens utterly meaningless. By vanquishing the external foe, he pulled the rug out from under the internal enemy. This transcends mere military tactics. This was political genius of the highest order. Miltiades shrewdly wielded the Persian army as a tool to resolve Athens's internal political crisis. He gambled the entire city to save its very soul. He transformed the battlefield into a grand assembly hall where the question of loyalty to democracy was settled not by vote, but by the thrust of a spear. He understood that the only way to unite a fractured society was to deliver it a magnificent, almost impossible victory. And therein lies the true magnitude of this event. Marathon isn't just a tale of David conquering Goliath. It's the story of how a fragile social experiment called democracy, for the first time in history, proved its viability in the most compelling arena, the battlefield. It was the moment an idea took on flesh and blood. The Athenians arrived on the plain of Marathon as citizens of 10 feuding clans, but departed as a unified people, forged by shared blood and common glory. It was the true birth date of the Athenian nation. The domino effect unleashed on the plain of Marathon transformed the world beyond recognition. The first tile to fall was the Athenians' self-perception. The victory bestowed upon them an unprecedented faith in themselves, in their democracy, in their destiny. They were no longer just another polis. They had become the saviors of Hellas. This newfound confidence, amplified by the political genius of Themistocles, one of Marathon's heroes, and fueled by the silver from the Laurian mines, led to the single most pivotal strategic decision in Greek history. Athens began constructing a navy, a colossal, formidable fleet unmatched across the entire Mediterranean. This very fleet, born from the spirit of Marathon, would become the primary instrument of victory 10 years later against the second, far more terrifying Persian armada of King Xerxes at the Battle of Salamis. The triumph at Salamis, in turn, cemented Athens' status as hegemon and led to the formation of the Delian League, a defensive alliance of Greek city-states under Athenian leadership. Then, the inevitable happened. The funds allies contributed for common defense began flowing into the Athenian treasury, transforming the alliance into an empire and its allies into tributaries. This wealth financed the construction of the Parthenon, sparked the debates between Socrates and Plato in the Athenian agora, and staged the tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus in its theatres. The entire golden age of Athens, all the classical Greek culture that formed the bedrock of Western civilization, was built upon the foundation laid at the foot of the Marathon tumulus. Even today, without realizing it, we constantly draw upon the legacy of that momentous day. The most obvious example is the word marathon itself. It originated from the legend of the messenger Phidippides, who, according to tradition, ran non-stop from the battlefield to Athens to shout, "Rejoice, we are victorious," before collapsing dead. Today, we label any lengthy endurance challenge a marathon, from a 26.2-mile race to an hours-long binge-watching session of a television series. The word has become synonymous with superhuman effort. But there's a deeper legacy too. Marathon forged one of the most potent and enduring narratives in our culture. The myth of a handful of free individuals who, through sheer spirit and unity, crush a giant, faceless army of tyranny. This narrative, from the Battle of the 300 Spartans to Hollywood blockbusters about rebellions against evil empires, repeatedly reproduces the same emotional matrix first cast in bronze on the plain of Marathon. We are programmed to empathize with David, not Goliath, and that program was written right there. However, this legacy also harbors a dark paradox. The victory achieved in the name of defending democracy from imperial oppression ultimately spawned a new Athenian empire, which itself began to suppress the freedom of other Greek city-states. Athens, which began as a liberator, ended as a tyrant. Its imperial ambitions led to the catastrophic Peloponnesian War with Sparta, which not only exhausted and ruined Athens, but all of classical Greece. Thus, democracy's greatest triumph contained the seeds of its future self-destruction. The ideal for which they died at Marathon, the freedom of the polis from external interference, was eventually distorted and transformed into its complete opposite: Athens' right to interfere in everyone else's affairs. The story of Marathon is not just a lesson in courage, it's also a grim warning about how easily the greatest victory can morph into a moral defeat. And this is where the story of Marathon ceases to be a mere tale of antiquity and transforms into a mirror, one that chillingly reflects our own fears and challenges. What, in essence, was the situation in Athens in 490 BCE? It was history's first global stress test for democracy. A young, still fragile system founded on complex procedures, debates, and every individual's right to a voice, confronted an utterly centralized, efficient, and ruthless autocracy. And the central question hanging in the air was profoundly modern. Can democracy, with all its disputes and disagreements, survive when it collides with a force that neither doubts nor reflects? The fifth column of Athenian aristocrats wasn't merely a band of traitors. They were proponents of a very tempting and, at first glance, pragmatic idea that remains alive even today. Their logic was simple. Democracy is a luxury for peacetime. In a moment of crisis, it's too slow, too cumbersome. What's needed is a firm hand, swift decisions, and compromises with an undeniable power. They didn't see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as realists, attempting to save the city from inevitable annihilation by sacrificing only ideological purity. They were history's first technocrats, ready to trade freedom for governability. And this is precisely where Miltiades and the Athenians who followed him deliver a crucial, non-obvious lesson. They intuitively understood that the external enemy's main goal wasn't simply to conquer your land. Their primary objective was to compel you, from within, to voluntarily relinquish what makes you you, to force you to doubt your own values, to fear your own freedom, to deem it ineffective, and ultimately to surrender yourself without a fight. A victory by the Persian army would have been a mere physical conquest, but a victory by the Athenian realists would have been a metaphysical catastrophe, the suicide of an idea. Marathon teaches us one simple yet terrifying lesson. In an existential crisis, the most dangerous enemy isn't the army on the horizon, but the quiet, rational voice in your own head whispering, "Let's be pragmatic. Our principles are just words. The most important thing is to survive." The marathoners proved that there are things more important than survival. The moment a society decides that its freedom, its dignity, its way of life are bargaining chips, mere collateral in negotiations for security, that is the moment of ultimate defeat, regardless of the battle's outcome. This lesson extends far beyond military history. It's relevant to any crisis, be it economic, political, or epidemiological. At every turning point in history, society faces the same marathonic choice: to freeze in the paralysis of fear, seeking salvation in compromises and the abandonment of principles, or to do something illogical, risky, but uniquely correct, to rush headlong towards the threat, defending not just life, but the very meaning of that life. And perhaps the most inspiring takeaway from this story is this: the victory at Marathon wasn't preordained by gods or fate. It was the sum of thousands of individual choices. The choice of Callimachus, the choice of every hoplite who didn't falter in the weakened center, the choice of every warrior who, after the bloody battle, found the strength to stand up and run 26.2 miles to his hometown. Marathon isn't just a place on a map. It's a symbol that in history's decisive moment, one bold, even insane, step forward means more than 1,000 hours of cautious deliberations. It's proof that sometimes the only way to protect an idea is to become its living, running, fighting embodiment. Let's shift our perspective for a moment and view this battle through the eyes of a Persian commander. To us, the Persians are a faceless horde from a textbook. But to themselves, they were the center of the civilized world. This was not an army of barbarians. It was a professional, multinational force of history's first global empire, stretching from India to Libya. An empire that built the world's best roads, boasted an efficient postal service, and governed dozens of peoples not just through force, but with a sophisticated administrative system. To them, the Greeks were merely bothersome, perpetually squabbling tribes on the distant periphery of their world. And this entire expedition wasn't a conquering campaign, but simply a police action, punishment for insolence. A few years prior, these Athenians had aided the Ionian Greeks in a revolt and burned the city of Sardis. For the Persian king Darius, this was more than a military defeat. It was a personal insult, a disruption of the world order he was called to maintain. Now, imagine the cultural shock experienced by the Persian command. Their world was built on a rigid hierarchy. There was the king of kings, his will, the law. There were satraps, commanders, warriors. Everything was logical and orderly, and then they encountered the Athenians. Who were these people? They had no king. They made decisions by shouting in a public square. Any shoemaker could challenge an aristocrat's opinion. They exiled their best generals, scratching their names onto pottery shards. From the Persian perspective, this wasn't democracy. This was anarchy, chaos, political madness. How could one trust an army commanded by 10 generals who rotated leadership every single day? How could one wage war against a people who didn't obey a single will, but instead followed the shifting opinions of a mob? To the Persians, the Athenians were savage, unpredictable, and utterly irrational. Their bronze-clad hoplites struck the Persians as clumsy and antiquated compared to the mobile Persian tactics which expertly blended archers and cavalry. Through the eyes of a Persian strategist, the Athenian army was little more than a disorganized rabble of heavily armed militiamen, formidable in a head-on clash perhaps, but hopelessly vulnerable to clever maneuver. The Persians regarded them not with fear, but with a bewildered disdain. They simply could not fathom the source of such audacious confidence in these peculiar people. They were absolutely convinced that the mere sight of their colossal, kaleidoscopic army, a vast tapestry of warriors from every corner of the known world, would shatter the will of these upstarts. And therein lay the tragedy of their predictability. The Persian war machine drew its formidable strength from its deeply ingrained traditions, its perfectly calibrated algorithm for victory. This algorithm had proven effective everywhere, from the blistering deserts of Egypt to the towering peaks of Bactria. Step 1. Demoralize the enemy with an awe-inspiring display. Step 2. Unleash a devastating volley of arrows. Step 3. Deliver the decisive blow with a flanking cavalry charge. So absolute was their faith in this system that they simply could not conceive of an adversary who would operate outside the bounds of all reason. Their very strengths, their order, discipline, and battle-tested tactics became their gravest weakness. They were meticulously prepared for a standard battle, played by rules they themselves had meticulously written. But the Athenians, it turned out, hadn't bothered to read the rulebook. When the Persian commanders watched the entire Greek phalanx, instead of advancing slowly and deliberately, suddenly erupt into a full-out sprint across the field toward them, they likely simply couldn't believe their eyes. This wasn't in any textbook. It was a flagrant violation of every established canon of war. It was the act of madmen, and this irrational, illogical sprint shattered their entire meticulously laid plan. It denied their archers crucial time, it threw their ranks into disarray, it sowed utter panic. The Persians didn't lose because they were inherently weaker. They lost because they confronted an entirely novel way of thinking, forged in the crucible of democratic debate and glorious chaos. They had come to quell a mere rebellion, but instead encountered an armed ideology. Not a single one of their previous victories had prepared them for this. The magnificent victory at Marathon was more than just a triumph. It was also a profound tragedy, marking the beginning of the end for its chief architect. Let us now turn our gaze to Miltiades' most agonizing and ambiguous decision, his order to attack. We rightly admire his audacity, but let us pause for a moment to truly grasp the sheer scale of his gamble. He didn't merely wager an army. He placed on the line every single able-bodied man in Athens, the entire genetic and social fabric of his beloved city. Had his brilliant plan faltered, had the Persians withstood the charge and closed their flanks, it wouldn't have been merely a lost battle. It would have spelled the absolute end of Athens as a viable entity. There would have been no one left to defend the city, no one to bear children. It would have been an act of civilizational suicide. Miltiades' decision wasn't just a risk. It was a monstrous, almost superhuman game of roulette played with the future of an entire civilization, predicated on his gut instinct and profound understanding of the enemy. And he won. Yet, a victory purchased at such an unfathomable cost rarely leaves one unchanged. Psychologically, Marathon broke Miltiades. He had saved democracy, and a grateful city elevated him to a pedestal akin to the gods. But within this adoration lay a deadly trap. The victory became a poison to him, an intoxicating drug of absolute righteousness. He ceased to be merely first among equals. He began to perceive himself as the living embodiment of Athens, a man whose will was the will of the people. The very fear of tyranny he had so brilliantly leveraged against his opponents now began to blossom within his own soul. He stopped heeding counsel, disregarding the sacred procedures of the popular assembly. He became utterly convinced of his own infallibility, and this burgeoning self-belief led him straight to catastrophe. Shortly after Marathon, riding the crest of his incredible popularity, Miltiades demanded a fleet and funds from the Athenians for a secret military expedition, promising unimaginable riches. He withheld the objective, simply declaring, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." And trust him, they did. He led the fleet to the island of Paros, intending to settle old personal scores under the thinly veiled guise of state interests. But his magic no longer worked. The siege of Paros failed. Miltiades himself was gravely wounded, and the expedition ended in utter disgrace. The genius of Marathon had devolved into an opportunist, exploiting the people's trust for his own self-serving ends. And more than one sacrifice was laid upon the altar of this success. The most emblematic of these was Polemarch Callimachus. This was the very man whose decisive vote had set the mechanism of victory into motion. Callimachus was no genius. He was the epitome of civic duty and responsibility. He listened to all sides, weighed the inherent risks, and made the most difficult decision of his life, to trust Miltiades. And he paid for that decision with his life, falling heroically in the thick of battle as the Athenian flank tore through the Persian ranks. While Miltiades reveled in accolades after the battle, transforming into a living legend, Callimachus lay among hundreds of other fallen heroes. He had done everything right. He had fulfilled his duty to the very end. But all the glory went not to him, the responsible administrator, but to the charismatic and brilliant adventurer. Herein lies one of history's darker truths. It remembers the dazzling flashes of genius, but often forgets those who, through their brave and measured support, allowed that genius to ignite. Upon Miltiades' return to Athens after the debacle at Paros, he was immediately brought to trial. He wasn't accused of military defeat, but of the most heinous crime for an Athenian, deceiving the people. The very people he had saved condemned him to an enormous fine, one he could not possibly pay. The hero of Marathon, the savior of democracy, died in prison from gangrene, a consequence of his inglorious campaign. He had saved the system, but that very system, true to its own unyielding laws, mercilessly ground him down the moment he presumed himself above it. The price of genius proved exorbitantly high, both for the hero himself and for those who believed in him to the very end. When we speak of the clash of civilizations, we often conjure images of a peaceful exchange of ideas in bustling port cities. But on the plain of Marathon, that clash was literal, physical, and deafeningly loud. It wasn't a dialogue, it was the thunderous clang of bronze shields. On one field, more than just two armies converged. Two entire universes collided. On one side stood the Athenian hoplite, a citizen who had purchased his own armor and voted for this very war. His strength lay in the unity of equals, in a wall of shields where each man protected his neighbor. On the other stood the warrior of the Persian Empire, be he Persian, Median, or Saka. He was a subject of the King of Kings, a cog in a gigantic, meticulously engineered machine. His strength resided in unquestioning obedience to hierarchy. This was a clash not of spears, but of social codes. The horizontal egalitarianism of Greek Isonomia against the vertical power of Persian authority. This conflict permeated everything, right down to religion. The Greeks went into battle bolstered by the support of their very human, capricious, and politically active gods, who bickered and reconciled just like people in the agora. The Persians, however, carried with them the idea of a single cosmic order, Asher, which on earth was represented by the almighty and almost divine king. For a Greek, the idea of prostrating oneself before another human, even a king, known as proskinesis, was the most humiliating act a free person could endure. For a Persian, it was the natural and only proper way to express reverence for sacred authority. What was order to some was slavery to others. What was freedom to some was chaos to others. At Marathon, they weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their very worldview. And from this brutal collision, arguably the most enduring and perilous cultural hybrid in history was born, the idea of the barbarian. Prior to the Persian Wars, the word barbaros was relatively neutral. It simply designated anyone who didn't speak Greek, someone whose speech sounded like an unintelligible barbar babbling. But the trauma of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea infused this word with a new, venomous meaning. A barbarian ceased to be merely a foreigner. They became an ideological antithesis, naturally servile, prone to luxury and despotism, cowardly yet cruel. The Greeks, gazing at the reflection of the Persian threat, for the first time in history, articulated the concept of the West, a world of freedom, reason, and law, pitting it against the East, a realm of tyranny, irrationality, and servitude. This mental chasm, forged in the dust of Marathon, would prove far more durable than the Persian Empire itself. The victory compelled the Greeks, and primarily the Athenians, not merely to despise, but also to study their enemy. A whole constellation of thinkers emerged, from Herodotus to Xenophon, who endeavored to understand how was this colossal empire organized? Why was it so powerful? Persian words such as satrap or parasang entered the Greek language and political lexicon. The Battle of Marathon sparked an intellectual explosion. It forced the Hellenes to realize that their world was merely a small, restless peninsula on the edge of a vast, complex, and ancient oikoumene, the inhabited world. From the necessity of understanding the enemy, entire disciplines were born: political geography, ethnography, and essentially history itself as a discipline attempting to find logic in the deeds of nations. So, how did this change the life of an ordinary Athenian? Firstly, the victory brought with it a new, unprecedented political paranoia. A deadly fear of medism, sympathy for the Persians, emerged. Any political opponent could now be accused of secret ties to the enemy. Ostracism, originally conceived as a weapon against tyrants, transformed into a tool for settling scores and eliminating anyone deemed insufficiently patriotic. After Marathon, Athenian democracy became not only more self-assured, but also far more suspicious and ruthless toward its internal dissenters. The old habit of fierce, yet ultimately internal political disputes gave way to a new reality where every careless word could be interpreted as treason. Secondly, on a daily level, Athenians encountered previously unimaginable luxury for the first time. In the captured Persian camp, they discovered not only piles of weapons, but also opulent carpets, golden tableware, and tents made of the finest fabrics. The simple Athenian farmer, whose greatest treasures might have been a pair of oxen and a bronze cuirass, witnessed a world of boundless wealth. This sparked a dual emotion. On one hand, contempt for the effeminate barbarians, and on the other, a secret latent desire to partake in this extravagance. It was precisely after the Persian Wars that the demand for Eastern imports gradually began to grow in Athens, shifting their austere way of life toward a more refined existence. Marathon was not only a victory over the Persians, but also the first inoculation of Persian material culture into the Greek world. Winning a battle is only half the fight. True victory lies in controlling the narrative. And the Athenians, immediately after Marathon, launched the first brilliant information campaign in history to forever imprint their version of events upon the minds of future generations. Their primary weapon was myth. The myth of the messenger Phidippides, who supposedly ran 42 kilometers to announce the victory and then died, is a purest example of brilliant public relations. Historians still debate whether this run actually happened, but that's irrelevant. What matters is that this story was the perfect PR bombshell. It transformed an exhausting collective forced march by a weary army into an unforgettable feat of a single hero, creating a symbol that has endured for millennia. The Athenians intuitively understood. For a story to become eternal, it must have a human face, even if that face is contorted in a death grimace. The public image of the battle itself was also meticulously constructed. The official version, later disseminated by Herodotus, championed unity, democratic fervor, and how free citizens, shoulder to shoulder, crushed hordes of slaves. All inconvenient details were meticulously purged from this narrative. The paralysis of command, the whispers of treason, the unsettling fact that victory was snatched from the jaws of near civil war. Miltiades, the complex and morally ambiguous former tyrant, was transformed into the unimpeachable savior of the fatherland. And the Marathon tumulus, where the fallen were interred, became more than just a burial site. It was the ultimate propaganda monument, the physical embodiment of this legend. Every generation of Athenian boys was led to this mound, so they might imbibe the myth of Marathon with their mother's milk. Miltiades' adversaries, the aristocratic faction, weren't sitting idly by. They had their own Black Ops unit, a specialized squad for psychological warfare. They couldn't deny the victory itself. That would have been political suicide. So, they started chipping away at the victor's reputation, launching a smear campaign that proved incredibly resilient. Their counter-narrative went something like this. Yes, Miltiades won. But he's no hero of democracy. He's a tyrant by nature, a reckless adventurer who merely got lucky. He saved us from Persian tyranny only to impose his own. Don't trust him. He's drunk on power. This campaign was quiet, subterranean, yet astonishingly effective. They didn't dispute the fact of victory, they poisoned its aftermath, sowing seeds of doubt in the heart of every Athenian. And this smear campaign eventually found its moment to strike. When Miltiades botched the expedition to Paros, his enemies seized their trump card. They roared across the agora, "Aha! There it is! We told you so! He's exploiting the glory of Marathon to settle personal scores. He's deceived the people." The accusation of deceiving the populace was a perfect propaganda coup. It struck at the very heart of democracy, at the idea of trust between citizens and their leaders. And this myth, the legend of a hero turned tyrant, proved no less powerful than the myth of the savior. It has endured to this very day, shaping our complex, dualistic image of Miltiades. We remember him both as the genius of Marathon and as a condemned criminal who perished in prison. The counter-propaganda worked, and this brings us to the crux of the matter. History, as they say, is written by the victors. Let's consider one specific event, that very war council held before the battle. The official account, the one penned by the triumphant Miltiades, paints a noble picture. The strategos were split 5-5. Miltiades delivers a fiery speech about liberty, and the polemarch Callimachus, inspired by his words, casts the deciding vote for attack. It's a beautiful tale of persuasive power. Yet, archaeology and logic tell a different story. The Marathon ostraca themselves, unearthed from a camp latrine pit bearing the scratched names of strategos and accusations of treason, completely upend this narrative. Most likely, there was no inspiring speech at that council. What transpired was a brutal political ultimatum. Miltiades, aware of the conspiracy, essentially held a knife to his opponents' throats. His arguments weren't about freedom, they were about the gallows. He exposed their hand, leaving them with only two choices: either join the battle and share in the glory, or be instantly accused of high treason. What went down in history as a democratic debate was, in reality, a ruthless special operation to neutralize a fifth column within his own command. But the victors penned a different, more convenient and edifying story. They concealed their internal divisions to bestow upon future generations a myth of unbreakable unity. And here we arrive at the moment when Marathon's pure impetus, the very idea of defending liberty, collided with its most formidable foe, the poison of its own success. The point of no return, the fateful decision that irreversibly warped the entire grand design, wasn't the battle itself, but what transpired afterward in the Athenian agora. Miltiades, at the pinnacle of his glory, addressed the people and requested a fleet and an army for a secret mission. He did not disclose the objective. He offered no explanations for his reasons. He simply declared, "Grant me power, and I will make you wealthy." And the Athenian populace, intoxicated by victory and mesmerized by the aura of their savior, made a fatal error. They granted him carte blanche. In that moment, democracy voluntarily relinquished its fundamental right, the right to oversight and full disclosure. The objective ceased to be communal and clear, to defend Athens. It became private and nebulous. Trust Miltiades. The means entrusted to him for the polis's defense became an end in themselves, a tool for the realization of his personal ambitions. This decision instantly fractured yesterday's allies. The unity of Marathon, forged in blood, cracked wide open. On one side stood Miltiades and the war party, pragmatists who argued, "We can't sit idly by. Marathon has given us strength, and we must use it to become wealthier and more influential. Power that goes unused is dead." Their logic was the logic of a predator who had tasted blood. On the other side stood the conservatives, men like Aristides the Just, who were horrified. Their stance was clear. Our strength lies not in aggression, but in moral superiority. We defeated the Persians because we defended our homes and our freedom. If we ourselves become robbers, attacking other Greeks for profit, How are we any better than the barbarians? We will betray the memory of the 192 heroes buried on the plain. This dispute wasn't about tactics. It was a battle for the very soul of Athens. And the pragmatists won. The fleet was handed over to Miltiades. The internal schism, which he had so brilliantly suppressed before the battle, now, after victory, erupted with a new, unstoppable force. But this time, the enemy wasn't a Persian satrap. It was yesterday's brother-in-arms. And here it is, the symbolic act that marked this turning point. Miltiades led the fleet not against the Persians, but against the tiny Greek island of Paros. Not to defend democracy, but to settle personal scores and plunder. Instead of a glorious battle on an open field, there was a dirty, humiliating siege of a small Greek town. The warriors of Marathon, the heroes of Hellas, were now doing precisely what the Persians had done, terrorizing their fellow Greeks. It was a complete undoing, a mockery of the very idea they had fought for. The apotheosis of this downfall was one specific episode. According to Herodotus, in desperation to take the city, Miltiades attempted to sneak into the sanctuary of the goddess Demeter on Paros at night, hoping to commit sacrilege and somehow break the defender's will. But as he scaled the fence, he fell and severely injured his leg. This wasn't merely an accident. It was a perfect, chilling symbol. The hero, whom the gods had protected at Marathon, was now punished by those very gods for his blasphemy, for his betrayal of Hellenic values. He went to Paros as a conqueror, but received a wound not from an enemy's spear, but from a sacred enclosure. His physical mutilation became the visible embodiment of his moral decay. He returned to Athens not with triumph and gold, but on a stretcher, with a festering leg and indelible shame. The idea of Marathon, the defense of liberty, was ultimately betrayed. It mutated into its very opposite, the right of the strong to aggression. This campaign served as Athens's first inoculation with imperialistic thinking. It demonstrated how easily a great defensive war could degenerate into a series of expansionist adventures. And although Miltiades was condemned, the very idea that military power could and should be used for enrichment took deep root in the Athenian consciousness. Marathon saved democracy, but it also birthed the demon that would ultimately destroy it. The victory at Marathon shattered Athens's old social structure. The main losers weren't the Persians, but the Athenian aristocracy. For centuries, they had built their power on two pillars, noble birth and a monopoly on military affairs. Marathon demolished both. It turned out that a crowd of commoner hoplites, yesterday's potters and farmers, could fight better and more effectively than noble cavalrymen. The aristocrats, who had advocated for compromise with Persia, were forever branded as cowards and potential traitors. Their political oxygen was cut off. Power began to flow to a new type of person, those from the common people who proved their loyalty to the polis not by their lineage, but by the scars on their bodies. A new, higher caste was born, the Marathon fighters, the veterans of Marathon. Their word in the popular assembly now carried more weight than the speeches of the most distinguished families. Athens' economy was quite literally built on the bones of its 192 fallen heroes. There wasn't enough direct war booty to rebuild the entire economy, but the victory delivered something far more valuable. It guaranteed the security of the Laurium silver mines. This was Athens' economic bedrock, their equivalent of an oil well. And it was here, after Marathon, that the Athenian demos made the most crucial economic decision in its history. When a new, incredibly rich vein of silver was discovered in the mines, there was a temptation to simply divide the wealth among all citizens. But the spirit of Marathon prevailed. Under pressure from the strategos Themistocles, a hero of the battle, the Athenians rejected immediate gain and invested every last drachma into building a fleet of 200 triremes. This was an unprecedented act of strategic investment. They transformed their victory on land into a guarantee of future dominance at sea. This fleet, changed everything. Athens became the primary naval hub of the Aegean Sea. Trade routes, once vulnerable to pirates and the Persian navy, now found protection under Athenian triremes. Merchants from across the Mediterranean flocked to the Athenian port of Piraeus because it was now the safest place to conduct business. Athens was transforming from a regional center into a global economic capital. Marathon didn't just save the city, it ignited the engine of its transformation into a maritime empire. Psychologically, Athenian society experienced more than mere euphoria. It was something deeper, a sense of divine chosenness. They, tiny Athens, had single-handedly saved all of Hellas. It seemed to them that the gods themselves were on their side. A powerful dose of collective messianism was injected into the Athenian consciousness. This incredible self-assurance became the fuel for the cultural and political ascent of the Golden Age. But this euphoria also had a dark, toxic side: paranoia. The exposed conspiracy of the fifth column left a deep, unhealing wound. Athenians realized that the most dangerous enemy could be sitting right next to them on the benches of the popular assembly. This fostered a culture of total suspicion. Ostracism, once a rare and extreme measure, transformed into a regular political tool to eliminate anyone who seemed too powerful, too popular, or simply not loyal enough. The Athenian worldview changed forever. They learned to be proud of their freedom while simultaneously living in panicked fear of those who might take it away, both from outside and within. They became citizens of the greatest polis in the world, but they paid for it with an eternal dread of the shadow of a traitor. Amidst the roar of battle and political intrigues, we risk overlooking the main point. Marathon was not just a clash of armies. It was the first armed conflict in history between two opposing philosophical systems. The idea that governed the Athenians was absolutely new and revolutionary: the concept of the political man. Just one generation before the battle, Cleisthenes' reforms had completely reprogrammed Athens' social code. Citizens no longer defined themselves through belonging to an ancient aristocratic lineage. Their identity was now built on their affiliation with the polis, an abstract yet all-powerful idea of a common cause. An Athenian hoplite went to die not for a leader or a clan. He went to die for his right to be part of this collective project, for his right to vote, for his right to be an Athenian. The intellectual engine of this entire process, its quiet architect, was, without a doubt, Cleisthenes himself. He wasn't a philosopher in our modern sense. He was a brilliant social engineer. His primary reform, the creation of new territorial phylae, or tribes, was an act of pure political genius. He essentially took the entire population of Attica and reshuffled it, artificially uniting urban dwellers, coastal residents, and rural inhabitants into a single administrative unit. In doing so, he shattered the old clan ties that had been a source of enmity and turmoil for centuries. He forced people who had never interacted with each other to become political partners. The unity of the Athenian army at Marathon, its ability to function as a single organism, was a direct consequence of these reforms. Cleisthenes wasn't on the battlefield, but the system he engineered was an invisible 11th strategos, the one who ultimately secured the victory. This groundbreaking revolutionary idea was met with fierce opposition from another philosophical doctrine, one ancient and exceedingly powerful. It was the ideology of the aristocracy, rooted in the concept of arete, the innate virtue and superiority of the best people, the aristoi. From their vantage point, Cleisthenes' democracy was an unnatural perversion. How could critical decisions possibly be entrusted to the oklos, the ignorant, emotional, and easily manipulated mob? To them, power rightly belonged to a select few, justified by birthright, wealth, and upbringing. In their eyes, this wasn't villainy. It was simply the one true, natural order of things. And this is where we grasp the true logic of the fifth column. Their willingness to strike a deal with the Persians wasn't merely treason. It was a conscious, ideological choice. The Persian Empire, with its sacred king, rigid hierarchy, and noble rule, was mentally far more appealing to them than their own Athenian democracy, which they viewed as chaos and a path to ruin. For them, returning to power under Persian protection wasn't a defeat, but a restoration of order, a return to normalcy. Thus, on the plain of Marathon, more than just Athenians and Persians clashed. It was a battle of two fundamental ideas: the citizen proprietor, whose strength lay in voluntary unity, against the subservient subject, whose power rested on unquestioning obedience. And Athens' victory became a resounding, bloody testament that a system built on conscious individual participation could generate a level of motivation, resilience, and tactical flexibility simply beyond the reach of even the mightiest despotism. Marathon didn't just save a city. It practically proved to the entire world, and more critically, to the Athenians themselves, that their radical philosophical experiment was viable. This triumph ignited the intellectual and moral confidence that fueled their entire golden age. It was after Marathon that they dared to think so boldly, build so grandly, and debate so freely. The philosophy born in the agora passed its trial by fire and sword on the battlefield, emerging tempered like steel. The grand system forged at Marathon didn't begin to crumble from an external blow. Instead, it began to rot from within, poisoned by the very venom of its own success. Immediately following the definitive victory over the Persians, as the external threat dissipated, the colossal energy previously directed outward against the enemy recoiled and struck inward. The system began to devour itself. Its entropy commenced with the formation of the Delian League. Initially, this was a defensive alliance of equals, infused with the spirit of Marathon. But very quickly, Athens, as the League's most powerful member, began to transform it into its own empire. The League's treasury was relocated to Athens. Allies who wished to withdraw from the League were forcibly compelled to remain. The very system designed to protect freedom became its primary gravedigger. And so began the fierce struggle for Marathon's legacy. Each new generation of Athenian politicians brandished this victory like a banner, yet each infused it with their own self-serving meaning. For some, like the aristocrat Cimon, son of Miltiades, the spirit of Marathon meant the continuation of a holy war against the Persians and an alliance with Sparta. For others, like Pericles, Marathon became the justification for Athenian imperialism. His logic was simple: we saved all of you, therefore we have the right to rule you. The funds from the allies, which ought to have gone towards shipbuilding, Pericles diverted to construct the Parthenon. He transmuted Marathon's moral capital into stone and gold, creating the greatest cultural monuments with money wrung from the very people he was meant to protect. The grand idea was torn to pieces. Its essence, the concept of voluntarily defending freedom, was stripped away, leaving only an empty shell, the right of the strong. The Peloponnesian War marked the apotheosis of this decay, a monstrous, drawn-out civil war that bled the entire Greek world dry as Athens and Sparta mutually exhausted each other. The Marathonian warriors had fought to prevent Greeks from becoming slaves to the Persians. Their grandchildren, consumed by fanatical fury, slaughtered one another to prove which of them would be the supreme master over other Greeks. The entire tragedy of this moment is encapsulated in the Corinthian speech, when, urging Sparta to war, they accused Athens of becoming for Greece precisely what the Persians once were: tyrants. The circle had closed. The system was devouring its own heart. But even amidst this bloody chaos, a final shard remained, the last living embodiment of the true, original spirit. This was no politician, no general. It was a philosopher, Socrates. He didn't build theories. He was a living incarnation of the idea of constant questioning, self-criticism, and the relentless pursuit of truth, the very intellectual bedrock upon which democracy had flourished. He served through the entire Peloponnesian War as a simple hoplite, honorably fulfilling his civic duty. And upon his return to Athens, He became its conscience, its perpetual gadfly, stinging the self-satisfied city by asking uncomfortable questions. What is justice? What is valor? You have built magnificent temples, but have you become better for it? It was he, Socrates, who became the final victim of the system he sought to save from itself. After their defeat in the war, humbled and embittered, Athens sought a scapegoat, and they found him in the old philosopher who dared to speak truth to their faces. He was accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, the standard charges for eliminating undesirables. And the Athenian democratic court, the very institution saved at Marathon, sentenced its wisest citizen to death. The execution of Socrates in 399 BCE became a symbolic point marking the end of an era. Physically, Athens still existed, but its soul was dead. The system born from the courage to ask questions and embrace responsibility ended by killing a man merely for asking questions. The journey from the Marathon tumulus to the cup of hemlock was complete. The great system didn't die on the battlefield. It committed suicide in the courtroom, forcing its finest son to drink poison. After Socrates' execution and the rise of Macedon, Marathon's grand legacy wasn't merely forgotten, it was consciously distorted. Alexander the Great, carrying Greek culture as far as India, paradoxically became its first gravedigger. He spread the Greek language, art, and philosophy, but he excised their heart, the political idea of the polis and the citizen. His Hellenistic world was one of monarchies, not democracies. Then came the Romans. They admired the military prowess of the Marathonian warriors, even copied their tactics, but they viewed Athenian democracy itself with aristocratic disdain, seeing in it only the rule of the rabble. In their world, valor was the virtue of a patrician, not a mere legionary. The legacy of Marathon was neatly dissected. Its military glory was placed in a museum, while its political fire was safely buried. Then followed centuries of true oblivion. In the world of medieval feudalism, built on a rigid lord-vassal vertical structure, the very idea of a free citizen as the source of power became not just heretical, but unthinkable. The word citizen vanished from the lexicon, replaced by subject. The story of Marathon, if ever recalled by rare monastic chroniclers, transformed into a hazy legend, a fairy tale of ancient kings and battles, completely stripped of its original political meaning. The spirit of Marathon didn't die. It fell into a centuries-long coma. The moment of rediscovery arrived in the late 18th century, during the Age of Enlightenment and great revolutions. Thinkers searching for intellectual weaponry against absolute monarchies rediscovered Herodotus and Thucydides. And what they read there had the effect of an exploding bomb. For the founding fathers of the United States and for the Jacobins of the French Revolution, Marathon ceased to be ancient history. It became their manifesto. It became historical proof that a republic of free citizens, united by a common idea, could crush any empire, no matter how powerful. They saw Miltiades not merely as a general, but as the first revolutionary commander, and in his warriors, not just Greeks, but the first citizen soldiers of their future nation. Marathon's most dramatic second birth occurred in the 1820s, during the Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire. Greek rebels and European Philhellenes, like Lord Byron, consciously went into battle with the names of Miltiades and Leonidas on their lips. They saw themselves as direct heirs to the heroes of Marathon, who once again, 2.5 millennia later, were fighting for freedom against Eastern despotism. The plain of Marathon once more became sacred ground, a source of inspiration, proof that the spirit of liberty is immortal. History had come full circle, and the battle that once created a nation now helped that nation to rise from the ashes. But it was precisely here, in the 19th century, that the most colossal misreading also took place. The era of nationalism took the myth of Marathon and imbued it with a completely new, alien meaning. Originally, it was a victory of ideology, of democracy over despotism. The new nations interpreted it as a victory of race and nation, of West over East, of Europeans over Asians. The hoplite fighting for his right to vote was replaced in propaganda by a patriot dying for the purity of blood and the sanctity of his native soil. The universal idea of freedom was supplanted by the narrow idea of national supremacy. And perhaps the greatest paradox of oblivion and memory is the modern marathon distance itself. Millions of people around the world run 42 kilometers, transforming a desperate act of saving democracy into a sporting event. We remember the distance, we remember the name, we remember the physical effort. But we have almost entirely forgotten why that hoplite actually ran. He didn't run to bring news of victory over an external enemy. He ran to warn the city about traitors within, to save democracy from a coup d'etat. We have preserved the body of the myth, but lost its soul. And so, having traversed this enormous journey, from paralysis in the command tent to the execution of Socrates and the myth's second birth in the fires of revolution, we return to where we began. To the very first question: can democracy, fragile and racked by disputes, survive a clash with ruthless force? The history of Marathon provides a resounding answer. Yes, it can. But completing the circle, it immediately presents us with a new, far more terrifying question. We began with the story of how democracy nearly perished due to an internal conspiracy, because of a fifth column of aristocrats ready to surrender the city to the enemy. And we conclude with the story of how that same democracy, having grown strong and self-assured, gave birth to a new fifth column, its own imperial pride, which ultimately led to its self-destruction. It turns out the threat never vanished. It merely changed its form, migrating from the outside inward. And here before us stands the central, irresolvable paradox of this entire history. The greatest victory in the name of freedom gave rise to an empire that obliterated that very freedom. An act of absolute unity against tyranny became the starting point for a civil war that destroyed everyone. The drive to forever secure democracy from external enemies led it to nurture an internal monster that devoured it. It turned out that defeating the Persians on the battlefield was the easiest part of the challenge. Far more difficult was to conquer the Persian within oneself, to overcome the allure of power, the temptation to believe oneself infallible, the urge to impose one's will on others by force, justifying it all with past triumphs. Marathon gave Athens a shield against the external world, but that same shield blinded them, preventing them from recognizing the fatal illness that was devouring them from within. And contemplating all this, a crucial question emerges, one that remains unanswered. Perhaps the real Battle of Marathon isn't a rare, heroic event that happens once every 1,000 years when a clearly defined enemy appears on the horizon. Is it perhaps the daily, grueling, and utterly unglamorous choice that confronts every free society and every single one of us? The choice between a reasonable caution that too easily morphs into timidity and a betrayal of our cherished ideals, and that very reckless, desperate plunge forward into the maw of fear, the one true act that ultimately renders freedom not merely a lofty word, but a palpable reality.